From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. Since Israel began bombing Lebanon, more than 2,000 people have been killed, more than 10,000 injured, and more than 1 million displaced. 50 Israelis have also lost their lives.
This is all that's left of an apartment block hit by an Israeli airstrike. The building flattened into a pile of rubble. The people inside didn't stand a chance.
Israel says it's targeting Hezbollah positions. From dawn, the attacks have been relentless. But this is not solely a launch site for the militant group. It is home to hundreds of thousands of people. And they are dying under intense bombardment.
Israel is delivering Hezbollah crushing blows. Today, new video shows Israeli troops raising the Israeli flag in a southern Lebanese village.
In southern Lebanon, where the Israelis are carrying out a ground invasion, not only is the death toll rising, but a number of UN peacekeepers have been injured too.
UNIFIL says its forces have been deliberately targeted by Israel's military, whilst Israel says they're being used as human shields by Hezbollah. It points to tunnels built next to UN compounds as evidence.
40 countries, including the UK, have condemned Israel's attacks on the UN mission. But the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, has called on UNIFIL, the group of UN peacekeepers who operate in southern Lebanon, to ignore their mandate and leave.
We regret any harm done to UNIFIL personnel, and the IDF is doing its utmost to prevent such incidents. But the best way to ensure the safety of UNIFIL personnel is for UNIFIL to heed Israel's request and to temporarily get out of harm's way.
With no end in sight, Netanyahu has promised that the bombing will continue, and he had this message for the people of Lebanon.
Free your country from Hezbollah so that this war can end. Free your country from Hezbollah so that your country could prosper again, so that future generations of Lebanese and Israeli children will know neither war nor bloodshed, but will finally live together in peace.
So much of what's happening in Lebanon now is an echo of the past. To understand how we got here and why the UN has a base in Lebanon, we really have to go back to the long history of war and occupation in the region. The Story today, a potted history of Israel and Lebanon at war.
My name is Lina Khatib. I'm an associate fellow with Chatham House, a think tank based in London.
And Lina, you were born in Beirut. It used to be known as the Paris of the Middle East. It's where all the Hollywood stars and singers would hang out. It hasn't been quite like that for a while, but if you were to describe Lebanon at its best, what would you tell people? I mean, could you take us to a street in Beirut maybe and just describe what it's like?
Lebanon in the 60s in particular was a destination for people who wanted to have a great time. There was a casino where famous people would, make appearances. Cabaret shows would take place. There was a famous hotel in Beirut called the Phoenicia Hotel that had a swimming pool where there was a glass wall and people in the bar at the hotel would be drinking while being able to watch people swim, up to that wall. It was pretty extravagant. It was a destination for international journalists as well, who wanted to cover the Middle East, but wanted a kind of fun place And at the same time, it was known as a hub of international spies. People who wanted to learn Arabic would also often end up learning Arabic in Lebanon, particularly because they could have such a cosmopolitan experience and have fun at the same time. So it was a bit like Europe, I would say.
And how would you describe it now?
At the moment, Beirut is very grim, unfortunately, and that's because you have a prevailing atmosphere of fear. You have displaced people sleeping on the streets. The promenade in Beirut, which used to be a very nice place to take a stroll by the sea, now has lots and lots of refugees literally sleeping on the beach. So it's a very, very sad state.
And Lina, to understand how we've got here, in a way, I think we have to go back in history and explain a lot of the battles between Israel and Lebanon over time. But in order to make sense of all of it, going back to the birth of Lebanon as a nation out of the wreckage of the Ottoman Empire, you kind of have to make sense of just the mix of people who live there. Just break it up for us. Give us a sense of the different religions that coexist.
Lebanon has always been mixed in terms of religious communities living together in this very, very small country. The rough divide at the moment in terms of numbers is a third Christian, a third Muslim Sunni, and a third Muslim Shia. When Lebanon was first created, the balance was a bit different. It was roughly half Christian, half Muslim. When Lebanon was first formed in 1920, in fact, when it was set up at a time of the French Mandate, the composition of the religious communities in Lebanon translated into creating a political system for the country based on power sharing between these different religious communities. Unfortunately, this system remains in place until today and has contributed to divisions amongst the communities in Lebanon instead of bringing them together, which was the original objective.
So it is a democracy, but along confessional lines. So the president is always a Christian, the prime minister is always Sunni, the speaker of the House is always Shia. It's a breakdown of sort of power sharing.
It is. And the problem with this system is that it means the different leaders of the sectarian communities began working not in the national interest, but in the interest of their own communities, and later just to basically line their own pockets.
And Lina, if we're doing a very quick whistle-stop tour of relations between Israel and Lebanon, I suppose we have to start in 1948 with the establishment of Israel and a war that broke out with a number of Arab states, including Lebanon, which actually left Lebanon weakened. Just explain what had happened.
So in 1948, the State of Israel was declared, and Arab countries refused to acknowledge this State of Israel because before Israel was declared as a state, there was recognition in the Arab world of the State of Palestine. And therefore, the Arabs decided to liberate Palestine from this new arrangement that in their eyes was not legitimate.
At that point, you begin something that becomes a feature of Lebanese life for decades to come, and that is the influx of Palestinian refugees into Lebanon, which, as you described, you have quite a delicate balance of power between, 50% Christian at the time, 50% Muslim. How does that play out?
1948 resulted in, unfortunately, massacres of Palestinians at the hands of the Israeli armed forces and Israeli militias. Palestinians started to flee north to Lebanon, and a lot of them started to settle in southern Lebanon. There were also Palestinian fighters who also started operating from southern Lebanon independently of the Lebanese state. And these fighters would frequently conduct operations from Lebanon into Israel. Eventually, this led to the formation of the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, as well as other armed Palestinian groups. And in southern Lebanon, they were basically almost a state within a state. And that created tensions between Lebanon's different communities. Some were sympathetic to the Palestinian cause and some were against it, saying this is eroding Lebanese sovereignty. So this added to the political tension in Lebanon, which kept growing for a number of years.
And in the mid-70s, you have the civil war breaking out in Lebanon. How much were relations between Israel and the PLO, which was based in Lebanon at the time, how much were they a factor?
So although Lebanon was by the 70s an independent state, it was not just the Lebanese army that was armed. There were all kinds of other militias in Lebanon at that time from different religious groups. And in 1975, one of the Christian militias that was against the Palestinians shot at a bus that had Palestinians inside it, killing all of them. And that incident sparked the Lebanese civil war, which was a war between the different militias that were in Lebanon at that time. And the war continued for a very long time. And meanwhile, the tension, of course, between Israel and the Palestinian factions that were in Lebanon was continuing.
13 guerrillas from southern Lebanon landed near the coastal highway north of Tel Aviv. They seized a crowded bus and sped off, shooting at passing cars. A gun battle with police ended the raid, but a total of 36 Israelis, 13 of them children, were killed.
And in 1978, Israel wanted to stop the attacks by the Palestinian fighters from Lebanon and therefore decided to invade Lebanon.
Israeli commandos landed from the sea, too, in their hunt for guerrillas. But these cars were packed with 20 non-combatants fleeing north from Tyre when they were fired on by commandos. 13 people, 5 of them children, were killed.
It is this invasion of 1978 that led the United Nations to create a mandate for the formation of the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, so the acronym is UNIFIL, and deployed UN peacekeepers to southern Lebanon. And these peacekeepers remain in Lebanon until today. And the original mandate of UNIFIL was to ensure the withdrawal of Israeli troops from Lebanon in 1978 and also assisting the Lebanese state to reclaim authority of southern Lebanon. This was kind of partially successful because Israel did withdraw after the first invasion in 1978, but the rest of the mandate of UNIFIL remains a bit vague, regarding assisting the Lebanese state. So I would say today that the presence of UNIFIL has been rendered largely symbolic in southern Lebanon.
They managed, part of their remit back then was to make sure that the Israelis left southern Lebanon. But a few years later, skipping ahead to 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon again. Just tell us very briefly what happened.
Again, the attacks by Palestinian factions did not stop, and Israel decided to conduct yet another invasion, and this time a much wider one. It reached Beirut. So, Lebanon is very small. Beirut is basically in the middle. And Israel managed to send its troops to go all the way to Beirut in 1982. This time it was an occupation, not just an invasion. Eventually, Israel withdrew to an area in southern Lebanon and remained in that area, occupying that for almost 2 decades, till 2000.
You were there at the time. What do you remember of that period, particularly in the early 80s?
1982 was a very scary period in Lebanon because the Israeli presence continued on the streets of basically half of Lebanon for several months. Israel at that time was cooperating with some of the militias in Lebanon who were against the Palestinians. And in 1982, this resulted in a massacre in a Palestinian refugee camp area where two refugee camps were called Sabra and Shatila. So this became known as the Sabra and Shatila massacre. The United Nations later recognized this massacre as a genocide, and it held Israel responsible for it because it was the Israeli army that had been in Lebanon as an occupying force at that time, witnessing and supervising and facilitating this massacre, while their partners, Lebanese militias, conducted the actual massacre. This was a really dark moment for Lebanon. It was, of course, targeted at the Palestinians, but it was something that affected all of Lebanon, something that people still remember in Lebanon today. So whenever the kind of idea of an Israeli occupation is invoked, people go back to thinking about this massacre because it's something that people do not want to see repeated.
It received huge international condemnation at the time. I mean, Margaret Thatcher, who was running Britain, banned weapon sales to Israel for more than a decade because of that. Inside Lebanon, it led to more of a resistance movement forming, and you sort of have the birth of Hezbollah. How were they seen within Lebanon?
So, because the Israeli invasion in 1982 resulted in occupation of an area of Lebanon in the south, which is the area bordering Israel, quite a few Lebanese wanted to liberate Lebanon from this Israeli occupation and began conducting military operations against Israeli troops. In the beginning, it was people from all backgrounds who took part in these operations. But eventually, with Iranian backing, Hezbollah was formed in the early 80s. It was set up with Iranian support and funding and training. And that's because the Iranian Islamic Revolution had happened in 1979. And part of its objectives was to have influence across the Middle East. And they did that by trying to get on board Muslim Shia communities, which is the same religious denomination that is dominant in Iran, to kind of rally around Iran. Such a community happens to be the largest community in southern Lebanon. And so, in a way, Iran took advantage of the grievances of the Shia community in Lebanon, which was the community most affected by the Israeli occupation, gave this community funding, set up Hezbollah, and continues to support Hezbollah until today. Now, Hezbollah conducted military operations against Israel for a very long time and claimed victory when Israel eventually withdrew from Lebanon in 2000. However, Hezbollah refused to hand its arms to the Lebanese state, claiming that its presence is needed to defend Lebanon from Israel. And this is why Hezbollah today is the only militia in Lebanon that remains armed when all other militias, after the end of the civil war, handed their weapons to the Lebanese army.
And it's stronger than the Lebanese army.
This is one of the biggest problems that Lebanon is facing. Hezbollah claims that it is needed for Lebanon's defense, but at the same time, Hezbollah actually wants the Lebanese army to be weak so that it justifies why Hezbollah needs to have this exceptional status. So with time, Hezbollah grew from a militia to becoming also a political party and eventually using its weapons domestically in Lebanon to eliminate its political opponents. And therefore, through sheer force, Hezbollah became the most powerful political actor in Lebanon. And this remains the case today. So in a way, Hezbollah has captured the Lebanese state. So it is not officially in charge of Lebanon, but it is stronger than the Lebanese army. And unfortunately, the Lebanese authorities have no say over Hezbollah.
Lina, take us to sort of the 90s. You sort of have the end of the civil war, and in 2000, the Israelis withdrew. The occupation ended. But the trouble doesn't end there. By 2006, you have another invasion. Just tell us what was happening.
I would describe the era between 2000 and 2006 as a tit-for-tat era of Israeli-Hezbollah military exchanges. So Israel withdrew in 2000, but every now and then Hezbollah still launched rockets on Israel and Israel still retaliated. But this was not high-level retaliation. So there was tension, but people eventually started rebuilding, going back to their villages in southern Lebanon, but it was always tense. And in 2006, Hezbollah decided to kidnap 2 Israeli soldiers. So it actually went into Israeli territory and did that. And eventually the soldiers were killed. And this sparked the 2006 war between Hezbollah and Israel, which became a large-scale war. Israel retaliated to the killing of its soldiers by bombing southern Lebanon quite severely and also attacked civilian infrastructure such as power stations, bridges. So it was a devastating war in Lebanon. But we have to remember that it was Hezbollah that sparked this war, and Israel did not limit itself at that time to targeting military targets in Lebanon as well.
Since then, even after October the 7th, a Hezbollah commander speaking to the Times described it almost as a dance. Everybody knew the moves. It was tit for tat. You would shoot at each other, but you knew where the limits were. How has that now blown up into a full-scale invasion?
So after 2006, because that war, as I said, resulted in Israel attacking civilian infrastructure, etc., there was a new UN mandate, and Hezbollah and Israel de facto agreed to basically limited their tit-for-tat engagement to military targets. So after 2006, Israel was not attacking civilian targets inside Lebanon, and Hezbollah was also only targeting kind of military sites inside Israel. And these attacks were limited on both sides. However, what happened is after the October 7 attack by Hamas, because Hezbollah and Hamas are allies, Hezbollah decided that to save face, it needed to show that it was aiding Hamas in its attack against Israel, and Hezbollah began launching rockets on Israel on an almost daily basis.
Hezbollah is now prescribed as a terrorist organization by both America and the UK, which is a more recent development.
Yes, Hezbollah, throughout its history, transformed from being just a militia calling for the liberation of Lebanon from Israel into becoming also an international terrorist organization conducting terrorist attacks in different places in the world. And that's why it eventually was prescribed by the UK and the US and others as a terrorist organization. And this is why the situation in Lebanon politically is quite complicated, because Hezbollah became a political party in Lebanon and has ministers in the government, but at the same time, it's designated as a terrorist organization in many other places. And so for this organization to be involved in launching rockets on Israel on a daily basis, according to international law, Lebanon here becomes the instigator of these attacks. So Israel has, in its retaliation against Hezbollah, been saying that it is acting as self-defense. The Lebanese state and Lebanese civilians are caught in the middle, because the Lebanese state did not authorize Hezbollah to launch these attacks on Israel. But Hezbollah acts, as I said, independently of the Lebanese state. It is now a huge issue because the Lebanese state never wanted Hezbollah to actually spark war with Israel, but it has been completely unable to prevent Hezbollah from doing so.
Lina, as someone who's watched Israel and Lebanon at war so many times during the course of your life, What do you make of what's happening now?
It is very depressing because the majority of the Lebanese people did not want Hezbollah to be involved in the war between Hamas and Israel. The majority of the Lebanese people wanted Lebanon to stay neutral in this particular war. However, Hezbollah single-handedly decided to attack Israel and sparked the war that is happening right now, which is affecting all of Lebanon, resulting in the displacement of many civilians. And the problem is the majority of the Lebanese who are against Hezbollah's involvement are not able to stop Hezbollah from launching attacks on Israel.
Israeli soldiers evacuated their own amid the chaos and carnage Sunday night. A single drone, part of a swarm that Hezbollah says it launched, was able to avoid Israel's advanced air defenses and smashed into a busy mess hall at dinnertime, killing at least 4 and wounding dozens more.
And at the same time, the Israeli bombing is spreading in Lebanon and also killing civilians, not just Hezbollah fighters.
Local residents have said they didn't hear anything like a missile. There was just this massive explosion. The videos that they posted on social media afterwards revealed a really appalling scene of destruction. Smashed up cars, great grey smoke and ash everywhere, and bodies lying all over the village, injured people as well, and really dreadful damage. And it's left to...
And so the devastation in Lebanon right now is really quite significant. Whole towns in the south have been flattened because Israel's campaign is so widespread. And the Lebanese people who are against this are completely helpless.
And Lina, we started by talking about Beirut in its heyday as the Paris of the Middle East. Now when you walk through the city, the buildings are still pockmarked by the damage that was done in numerous wars that it's lived through. How much does this sense of perpetual war affect Lebanese society? Is there any hope for this cycle of violence ending?
When I think of people who are now, say, in their 80s in Lebanon, and think how many wars they have witnessed in their lifetime, it's a really grim cycle. No one really expected to see Lebanon go through this today. And this is evidenced by the massive investment that the Lebanese made, to reconstruct southern Lebanon after 2006 and to set up businesses in Lebanon, thinking that's it. The situation is very depressing and the prospects for peace remain low for as long as the Israel-Palestine conflict is not resolved. Ultimately, this is at the heart of the issue, that the Israel-Palestine conflict is giving Hezbollah an excuse to claim why it is needed for Lebanon's defense. Ultimately, Lebanon's stabilization is intimately linked to the issue of Iran's involvement in the Middle East, which has been a destabilizing role because Iran took advantage of the Israel-Palestine conflict to rally the Shia community under the banner of liberating Palestine. But in reality, Iran is doing this so that it can spread its own influence in the Middle East as well. So Lebanon is basically caught under the intersections of the Israel-Palestine conflict on the one hand, and on the other hand, Iran's regional destabilization in the Middle East.
That was Lina Khatib from SOAS and Chatham House. You can read more from Lina as part of our ongoing coverage of the conflict in the region at thetimes.com. I'd recommend starting with her article from last month on why the killing of Hezbollah's leader Hassan Nasrallah marks the beginning of the end for Iran. The producer today was Sam Chantarasak, the executive producer was Fiona Leach, and sound design and theme music were by Mao Lassetto. If you want to get in touch with us, our email is thestory@thetimes.com. Do let us know what you'd like to hear us cover next. And if you want to learn more about the origins and governance of Hezbollah, do have a listen back to our recent episode, What is Hezbollah? And Can Anyone Avert All-Out War? We'll stick a link to it in the episode notes. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.